Blood bather. Once a year, my parents had me take a blood bath. It was always on the day before my birthday, a tradition I didn't enjoy, but never questioned. My mother would lead me to the tub, my father sitting on the edge, dipping his fingers in to check the temperature for me. I would sit while they washed it into my skin and hair, making sure that I was completely covered before letting me get out. Then I would have to wait as it dried, making my skin feel tight and sticky. I was then sent off to bed with a hug and kiss. On my birthday, the first thing I did was shower off, watching the red retreat down the drain. Then it was like any other birthday, singing, presents and cake. It never crossed my mind that our tradition was abnormal. I was excited for my 10th birthday. The prospect of having 2 digits to my age was exhilarating to me. I'd been homeschooled my whole life, but had plenty of friends in my neighborhood to invite to my party. I was asking my friend, Jimmy, if he was going to be able to come when I caught a glimpse behind the veil. Man, I have to go visit my cousins on Saturday, but maybe I can play with you. The day before, he had asked. I thought about it, but knew that my annual bath was due that day. Disappointed, I explained to him why that wouldn't work. Shucks, that's the day I have to take my bath, I told him. Okay, well maybe after that. No, I'll be all sticky. Plus all the blood gets on everything. I could tell by his expression that I had said something wrong. He went running his mouth to everyone, calling me a vampire and upsetting both of our parents, albeit for different reasons. That night, I had the first discussion about the blood baths with my father. He sat me on the couch and got real serious. Now, Ben, today will be the last time you ever talk about the baths you have to take, he stated sternly. He went on to explain that not everything we did was considered normal, and that by keeping it to myself, I was doing us all a favor. After that discussion I became more curious. It was intriguing to me that not everybody had to take these baths. As I aged into a teen, I started doing what all boys do. I rebelled, and hard. Since I didn't go to school, I tried even harder to fit in. When I was around my friends, I smoked, I vandalized, I stole alcohol from my parents. Some of it could be attributed to peer pressure, but a lot of it was my own choices. I wanted a reputation, wanted to be revered as some sort of anarchist, so I kept pushing boundaries, creating a large wedge between my parents and myself. The eve of my 16th birthday I decided that I would refuse my blood bath. I was lying on my bed, listening to music and reading, when my mother came in to tell me they had gotten it ready for me. I knew it was coming. Had my response ready? I'm not taking it, I said, refusing to look up from my book. Ben, please don't make this difficult. You know you need to, she said, wringing her hands fretfully. I continued to ignore her as she pleaded. After a while my father came down to see what the delay was. What's going on? He asked, peering in the doorway. My mother told him the situation, his face turning bright red. Ben, this is happening one way or another, he shouted. I threw my book across the room. Oh, you think so? I fired back, instantly bristling to the challenge. His eyes widened and his nostrils flared out. He was more angry than I had ever seen him. That's right, his voice now becoming a growl. Without a second thought I charged at him, knocking him aside, and running down the stairs. I could hear him screaming at me all the way past the driveway, begging me to return. I ran for a long time, finally running out of breath and resting near a city bus stop. I sat down for a few minutes, aware of a strange sensation at the ends of my fingers. They felt tingly for a bit, then they started to feel hot. Terrified, I watched as they began to blister, running up past my knuckles, and cracking open the skin on their way upward. Howling in agony and shocked by what I was seeing, I fell to the ground and writhed. There wasn't a soul around. My cries for help went unanswered as the skin kept on bubbling and cracking, making it all the way up to my elbows. Headlights appeared in front of my eyes. Though I was nearly blind with pain, I recognized my father's car. He leapt out, grabbing me under my armpits, and pulling me into the vehicle. I kept screaming during the drive, showing him my disintegrating arms. We drove at a breakneck pace, my father cursing the whole time. His face white, he told me to hold on a little longer, that I would be okay soon. I expected him to take me to a hospital. When we pulled into our driveway my entire arms and shoulders looked like raw hamburger meat, the skin blistering around my neck and down my sides. It was the most intense agony I had ever been in. My body went into shock. I vaguely recall being carried out of the vehicle, my mother running out to help. We went up the stairs, both of them grunting under my weight. Then blackness took over. Voices around me, swirling distortedly, started to come back into focus. Gradually, the sensation of pain seemed to lighten. My arms were no longer on fire. He was this close, this fucking close, my father was saying, sounding like he was going to break into sobs. My mother hushed him, telling him he had done a great job, that he had saved me again. I could now feel that I was in a familiar substance, warm, inviting, soothing to my blistered skin. The blood bath. When they noticed I was awake, they both broke down, telling me how worried they had been, how they could never live without me, that I was their entire world. Their hysterics got me going as well, realizing how awful I had been to them over the last year. They both held onto my hands as I let the blood saturate and heal my mangled skin. The next year I had learned my lesson. My father prepped the tub for me, giving me a half smile as I thanked him after he told me it was ready. I never asked why I had to take them. I never asked where the blood came from. It just seemed like something that we all knew was better off left alone. Which brings me to this year. My father, who is now in his 60s, sat me down again. Ben, it's time you understand some things. He went on to explain that, late in my mother's pregnancy with me, she started having complications. She was on bed rest for a while, barely able to move. She delivered me 2 weeks before her due date, slightly underweight, but very sickly. He explained that he could do little for me, but watch as doctors and nurses did their best to keep me alive throughout the next months. I felt helpless. I begged to trade places with you, and take the suffering you were going through from you, he told me, reaching forward and taking my hands. There was this man. I had seen him at the hospital often. He saw what we were going through, our family, and he offered me something, told me he knew a way to help keep you alive. I didn't want to hear it. I told him to leave me alone, but he persisted, claimed he was an angel of sorts. As you got sicker and sicker, closer to death's door, he kept telling me he could help. I shook my head. This was a lot to take in, all new information to me. My father continued, tears spilling from his eyes as he went on. Ben, I was desperate. I loved you so much. I couldn't lose you. I gave in, asked him to help. I begged, told him, whatever he had to do it. He smiled at me, told me he would save you. And just like that, you started to get better. I was shocked, the doctors even more so. We went home. You were healthy. It was a miracle. He wiped his eyes, leaned backward, trying to gather his thoughts, then looked at me. It was just before your first birthday, when I saw the man again. It seemed like he had come out of thin air. He said the only way for you to stay alive was to give you your baths each year. I didn't believe him at first, but then we saw what was happening to you, to your skin. It was just like what happened when you were turning 16, only then it was much slower. He spoke shockily. So I did what I had to do. I spilled the blood. I filled the tub, and I have done it each year since. I'm sorry, son. I wish things had gone differently, he finished. I leaned forward and embraced him, having no words for the situation. We stayed like that for a while. Eventually he broke it off, facing me again. Ben, there's something else. You know that I'm getting older. The time will come, maybe sooner than we think, that I won't be around anymore. He bit his lip, holding in his emotion. Ben, when that happens, you'll have to start filling the tub up yourself. My wife bought a reborn doll to cope with the death of our child. My child died after only a month on this earth. I'm going to spare myself the tears on explaining how, but the tears of my wife are ones I'll never forget. Grief is ugly. It's so fucking ugly. When we lost him, it sounded as if my wife was regurgitating fragments of her soul. Her wails could have shattered glass, curdled blood. The cries would turn to screams, screams at the universe, at whichever sick, twisted higher power would let this happen, at herself, at me. She'd scream until the skin of her throat shredded to ribbons. I'll be honest, I didn't cry. I don't remember if I even shed a tear, but not because I wasn't upset. I didn't cry because it felt like she was already doing it for me. No pain is more shared than a grieving mother's cry. I wish there was a handbook on grief, for dummies, if you will. One that could have especially prepared me for the before and the after. Before, you're just waiting, like you're watching an hourglass of life, on its last grain. My heart is pumping while he flatlines, and it hits like a wave. I'm going to have to grieve, I thought to myself. Before I could even experience it, I thought about how it was coming right for me. And I knew that in the blink of an eye, life was going to be something that I'd have to fight for. Maybe I was already grieving him before he went. Maybe I was prepared. Or I just thought I was. I don't think you ever could be prepared. Then, you reach the after. Not the moment you leave the hospital room, or even the drive home. It's the moment you open that front door, the air sucked out of the room, and you feel that thorough fucking void. That void in your chest, in your relationship, in your home. This is it. This is my life now. This is real. What hurt even more was that this new life wasn't so foreign to me. It was one I had nearly a month ago. I felt so guilty for not grieving him, but instead grieving for what he could have been. I grieved for the first birthday and dozens after it. The first steps, the graduations. I'd even trade a hormonal teen fight with him over this. I couldn't help but grieve the life he could have had instead of the one we lost. My wife felt differently. She missed their skin touching, humming to him, even dragging herself out of bed at 3 a.m. because he was crying again. We never really discussed it, but we could just tell that we were grieving down to separate paths. Our backs were always turned in bed. She'd flinch when I'd touch her. It was as if she was allergic to me, but I understood she needed her space. The funeral was absolute hell on earth. Actually, I think rotting in the fiery pits of hell would feel better than attending an infant's funeral. At least it'd be warm, unlike the icy grip of mourning. I remember walking up to the casket alone, staring down at him, and all I could think was, caskets shouldn't be that small. He laid in a box that was small enough to cradle in my arms. When they lowered him into the ground, the cries emerged again. My wife wailed into the clear morning sky, so guttural it was as if it was happening all over again. But she didn't collapse into my arms, she collapsed to the ground, as if she wanted to join him. Then you open the front door again, and the voids are even deeper. Everything is even realer. We packed up our child's nursery, and his future, into boxes, then fought about whether or not to throw it all out. She said she wanted them in the attic. I said I'd never be able to go up there again if we did. So we just left it all in that room, collecting dust. The door stayed shut at all times, but never locked, just closed. I think it symbolized our grief, in a way. We closed the door on that part of our lives, but weren't ready to lock it away forever. Each day doesn't get easier. It just gets farther away from the day it happened. The mornings are the worst. You wake up, your eyes creak open. The morning sun is pouring through your window, and then you remember that you're grieving, as if you could forget. Little things began to tick us off. One of us would forget to do the dishes and it'd end up with someone sleeping on the couch or taking a long midnight drive. We tried couples therapy, but we needed so much more therapy than that. It wasn't even about us, it was about him. The wedge was him. I was at my wit's end with how to deal with this, but it appeared that my wife was one step ahead of me. When I heard a soft humming from our bedroom after I came home from work, my brows furrowed as I made my way upstairs. The last time I heard her hum this tune was at the hospital, right before the heart rate monitor hummed back. When I pushed the cracked open door, I felt like I was dreaming. She was laying in our bed, cradling a baby in her arms, looking down at it like she could see every planet, every star, every galaxy. I remember pinching my thigh as I stared at her, the slight pain stinging. She was so engrossed by it. I could have stood there till the end of time and she wouldn't have noticed. Honey? She finally looked up. Oh, hi. She stretched a smile that had become so foreign. What? Do you? What are you holding? Oh, this. It's a reborn doll. I raised a brow at her. They're realistic dolls for mothers to help me cope. She nodded rapidly, her smile weakening. It was as if I had disrupted the fantasy just by asking. Oh. I couldn't help but stare at it, and stare at her because of the way she'd stare at it, as if she was holding her own flesh and blood and not plastic. Has it helped? I've only had it for a few hours now, but it's comforting. It rubbed me the wrong way at first, but if nothing else was working, I was glad if this would. Do you want to hold him? Suddenly, I felt myself at a crossroads. I didn't know if I could hold a doll and give her the reaction she wanted. I can't look at it like it's my son, but I knew that this wasn't just about me. So I hesitantly walked over and stretched my arms out. A slight chill ran down my spine as its cold skin was placed onto my palms. I pulled it close and cradled it, staring down at it. And suddenly, I crumbled into tears. It felt too fucking real. I dropped to my knees as it laid in my shaking arms, my scrunched face already wet. I knew it wasn't actually my son, but I realized how much I missed this. Not just the moments we lost. My wife patiently waited as I wailed with my head hung. I let out cries I never knew I could, my voice cracking with each ugly sob. After that day, I noticed things getting better. It didn't fill the voids, but something else stood inside of them for a while, just to keep them dormant. Whenever she had one of those days where standing on her own 2 feet didn't feel worth it, she'd hold it, hum to it. Sometimes she'd pretend to breastfeed it. I will admit it still creeped me out to some extent. It was comforting in a way, but I knew it wasn't him. And I think this is when the wedge grew deeper. One day I came home, and as I walked upstairs, my entire body locked as I saw light leaking out of a door. That door, I knew it was unlocked, but I never expected either of us to ever open it. At least not so soon. I swallowed roughly as I approached it. Slowly opening the door revealed empty boxes and a full nursery. She had set up everything again. I observed the room as I stepped in, a feeling of concern weighing on me. Then, I noticed something in the crib. I wrapped my fingers around the railing and leaned in, my brows furrowing as I saw the doll laying. I didn't hear you come in. My body jolted as I whipped around, Jesus. Sorry, you. What is this? What? What is this? Ah, our nursery. Well, yeah, but why is everything unboxed? Our baby needs a nursery. We stared at each other with accusations of insanity. Look, I've researched these dolls, and I understand how this helps you. I'll admit, it's helped me a bit too. But this, you know this isn't our. This isn't our what? Suddenly I was tongue-tied. I'm just concerned. I unpacked all of this myself. I'll put it all back when I want to. Okay, she said slowly and sternly, daggers shooting from her eyes. I could feel a million words crawling up my throat, but the only thing that came out was, okay. I think I need some alone time with him. I nodded, looking away as I slipped past her. I was trying to be patient with her. I really was, but I just couldn't meet her at the length she was going. Pretending this is our kid may help her, but it only made me feel worse. That night, not a word was exchanged under those sheets. I was turned towards the window, and she was turned towards the baby monitor that she put new batteries in. After making faces out of the moon, I eventually fell asleep. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, I felt myself drift away from my dream and wake up. My eyes slowly creaked open, the dim moonlight coming through the window. The room was silent, except for the cries that came through the baby monitor. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, staring at the monitor as staticky cries emitted from the speaker. Liv, wake up. I shook my wife till she groaned out of her slumber. She lifted her sleeping mask and looked at the monitor. My eyes darted towards her, then back at the monitor. She sighed, tossed her mask onto the dresser and stood up. I'll handle him. Get some sleep. I stared at her wide-eyed, my throat knotted, as she tiredly walked out of the room. As she stepped into the nursery, I began to hear her over the speaker. It's okay? I blinked like a deer in headlights as I listened to her hum, the crying slowing to a stop. My eyes shifted towards the door as she walked back in, grabbed her sleeping mask and laid back down. She didn't say a word as I just continued to stare. A part of me wanted to go into the nursery, but I just laid there till my eyes dried and ran bloodshot. Before I knew it, the sun was up and I had to go to work. I slowly stood up and stiffly got ready. I tried to convince myself that it was a dream, but I had already woken up from one. When I finished getting dressed, I kissed her as she slept and left the room. As I passed the nursery, I paused for a moment. At first I considered going in, but instead I pressed my ear against the door. But there was nothing, just absolute silence. I don't know what I thought I was going to hear. I didn't even know what I heard last night. I couldn't tell if hearing something now would have made me feel more or less insane. That day at work was grueling. I kept falling asleep at my desk, had a hard time processing what people were even saying to me. It was just one big blur. When I got home, the first thing I wanted to ask my wife was, what the fuck happened last night? But after the incident in the nursery, I feared she'd tell me that the doll crying is normal because it's our son. When I got home, I was ready to fall flat on my face. My wife stood at the sink washing dishes, her head turning as I walked in. Hey, hun. Hi. How was work? You know, the usual. Be quiet when you go upstairs. I just put him down, and it wasn't without a fight, she chuckled. I'll be sure not to wake it. Him. I anxiously cleared my throat as she quickly glared at me, then looked away. At least I was trying to play along. I quietly walked upstairs, minimizing the creaks of each step. As I passed the door, I could feel my breathing and heartbeat halt to a stop. Something about it just always knocked the wind out of me. Dinner was so silent, you could hear a pin falling before it even dropped. Chewing and sipping filled the dense quiet. I was thinking of taking him to a mommy and me class. I looked up, my chewing slowed. Is that? Sounds good. I bit my tongue and smiled. I couldn't tell if she was being serious, or if she just wanted to talk. I also wish you'd spend more time with him. You avoid the nursery like the plague. She laughed weakly. I'll make sure to do that. Thank you. Watching her eat, the look on her face, I could tell she could barely get the food down her throat. She was trying. She was really fucking trying. I felt guilty for not being more understanding. It was hard to accept that we were just going to be grieving in different ways, no matter what. But I was at a crossroads when it felt like our grief couldn't help each other. But the one thing that was itching at the back of my mind was last night. It was crying. How could it be crying? It didn't seem to surprise her either. I tried to make any logical reasoning for it. Maybe she set an alarm with a baby crying sound. Or if there's a speaker inside of it, something to make it feel realer. It was possible, except for one other thing. It sounded so much like him. If you're not a parent, a baby crying is just a baby crying. but I could pick out those cries from a crowd. Maybe it's just grief playing mind games. I couldn't tell. Later that night, after brushing my teeth, I was walking to our bedroom when I noticed my wife in the nursery. She was slowly rocking back and forth in the rocking chair, humming to it. "Hey, I finally got him to sleep," she said after noticing me hovering in the doorway. "That's good. Come say goodnight." I stared for a moment before forcing myself to enter the room. She stood up and walked over to the crib, then gently placed it down. She leaned down, kissed his forehead, then turned to me. I glanced at her, then at it. I could tell she was expecting me to do the same. I hesitantly leaned towards it. My lips puckered. Suddenly, as I got closer, a pungent smell entered my nostrils. I tried to ignore it, but I recoiled as I got closer, the foul stench growing stronger. My wife glared at me, in horror as I gagged, clasping my hand to my mouth. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" "I am sorry, him, not it, him." "Okay, he smells like a fucking dumpster fire." "What? Does he have built-in fecal mechanics too?" Tears welled in her eyes as I looked away with guilt, my entire body shaking. "Just admit that this is a joke to you. You think I'm embarrassing myself, that I'm crazy. Just say it." "Liv, no. Actually, don't. Just sleep somewhere else tonight. The couch, the fucking sidewalk. I don't care." "Okay." I flew out of the room before I could burst into tears of fury. I felt like such a fucking monster. Prioritizing both of our healing was just tearing me apart. It was tearing us apart. I curled up on the couch and screamed into the pillow, leaving tear stains on the cover. I sobbed until it exhausted me, eventually knocking me out. All of a sudden, I was ripped from my slumber at the sound of glass shattering, my body jolting awake. I quickly sat up, my eyes darting around in a blur. Throwing the blanket off of me, I stood up and searched for the source of the sound. The room was pitch black as I ran my hand along the walls to find a light switch. Suddenly, my eyes shot open as something sharp impaled the bottom of my foot. "Fuck. Sheet," I hissed to myself as I lifted my foot. Now I was hopping around till I found a light switch, while also avoiding glass that I could not see. Eventually, I found one and illuminated the kitchen. I looked down at my foot. A small train of blood drops behind me. I lifted it up, blood leaking down my skin. It was a small shard of porcelain, so I pursed my lips, took a deep breath, bit my cheek and yanked it out. I swallowed a scream as I placed the crimson-coated shard on the kitchen counter. Then, I noticed some white powder on the bottom of my foot as well. I limped around the kitchen, soon finding a shattered cookie jar, and an open flour bag spilled across the floor. God fucking damn it. I quickly tied an unused dish rag around my foot, and began picking up the shards. The stress of the cut and the mess overshadowed the thought of how it even fell in the first place. But this thought came front and center when I noticed small flour-coated footprints leading out of the kitchen. I slowly placed the last shard in the trash as my eyes stared under furrowed brows. I limped over and kneeled down, observing them closely. They looked like, no, impossible. I told myself it was impossible, but who else could have feet that small? It wasn't my wife, and it wasn't an animal. An uneasiness clouded over me as I quickly vacuumed it up. The trail was longer than I realized as I exited the kitchen and made my way through the living room. Eventually, I reached the stairs. Noticing the footprints went up them too. My eyes slowly glided up, then stared deeply into the dark hallway. I was able to at least try and logically explain the crying the other night, but I couldn't make anything of this. I took a deep breath and slowly made my way upstairs. With each footprint that vanished into the vacuum added one more beat to my pounding heart. When I reached the top step, I realized the trail led even farther. I continued to follow it, taking the curve it took that ended at a door. That door. I slowly stood up, my heavy, shaking breaths hitting the wood, but I couldn't bring myself to go in. I just wanted to cry, feeling like I was being haunted by my own grief. I could have been standing there for a minute or an hour. Either way it felt like forever before I finally stepped away and entered the bathroom. I held back tears as I made sure there wasn't any glass left in my foot, then properly bandaged it. With everything that had happened and was happening, all I could think was, why us? Why me? I just wanted to be a husband, a father, a family. Why does life's unfairness have to be so cruel? It's more than just not getting what you want. It's losing what you love. It's your son dying after only a month of being. It's not unfair. It's just cruel. So fucking cruel. After securing the bandage, I limped out of the bathroom, my body weighing with exhaustion. Then, I halted in front of the nursery door, my eyes scrunching shut as the sound of crying suddenly came from behind it. Never in my life have I prayed, not even for my son. It felt like shouting into a void. But at that moment, I prayed. I prayed for it to end. I needed it to end. But nobody was listening. Life wasn't that fair. I should be known that. I opened my eyes, tears welling in them, and kept walking past it. The cries grew fainter as there was a ceiling between us, but I could still hear them. I could feel them crying for Daddy as I laid my heavy head on the couch pillow. I had hoped that my wife would wake up and deal with it, but she never did. The entire night I laid there, the tears drying against my cheeks as it relentlessly cried. My psyche was shattering piece by piece as it grew impossible to even keep a grasp on reality or try and figure out what the fuck was going on while its screams filled my ears and bounced around in my skull. At that point, I just wanted to die, or to at least just be numb. To have the ability to not give a single fuck about anything happening, even if just for 5 seconds, would have helped me sleep that night. By the time it was morning, the crying had stopped at some point, but I don't remember when. "Jack," my wife suddenly said, her hand resting on my shoulder. I jolted, my head whipping towards her. "Didn't mean to scare you? It's fine. I just didn't sleep." I could see guilt hanging on her expression. "Is everything all right? I want to apologize for last night. You've been very patient with me, and I feel like I've been asking you for more than you can handle." We paused in silence for a moment, our eyes shifting around each other. "I appreciate it. I'm sorry, too. I've been too judgmental. We don't have to be on the same page to care about each other." She sat down next to me and rested her head on my shoulder. I kissed the top of her head and enjoyed the quiet with her. I wanted to bring up what I saw last night, but figured now wasn't the right time. "And about the smell, you weren't wrong. I went to go see him this morning, and it hit me like a truck," she chuckled weakly. "Turns out he was molding on the inside, which can happen, apparently." I reached out to the cellar and she said that it happens due to poor upkeep. Suddenly, she broke into tears, collapsing into my chest. I held her close as her tears soaked through my shirt. "How did I manage to lose him twice?" My heart shattered. It's okay, you can always get a new one." "No, I can't." I looked into her eyes with deep concern. "Olivia, can we speak honestly for a moment, with no hard feelings?" She slowly nodded. "It's a doll. You can get a new one." Even then, I pushed the wrong buttons, as she ripped herself from my arms and stormed upstairs. "You don't get it. You never did. You know what? No, that's not fucking fair. None of this is fucking fair." Before I could get another word in, she was already in our bedroom, the door slamming behind her. I buried my face in my hands as I drew deep, slow breaths. Everyone always said grief brings people together, but all this is doing is tearing everything apart. My marriage, myself, my understanding of what's real and what isn't. I spent another workday in a complete daze. I even got reprimanded by my boss for lack of work ethic. When I got home, I was met with a distraught wife. She was definitely still mad at me, so I considered whether or not to even ask if she was okay. "Hey, hon, are you alright?" I threw him out. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Are you?" "Liv." "Surprised you didn't say. Thank God. Look, I am sorry about this morning, but I'm trying, and I know you know that. But it's hard, when you keep flying off the handle. Do you want to see somebody? A grief counselor." He was my grief counselor. "That's why I'm getting another one, just like you said." Right. Whatever works for you." I smiled weakly. She sipped her coffee with a daze in her eye, like she could see something that wasn't there. Just by looking at her, you could tell she was dangling at the edge. But I couldn't pry and prod anymore, for her sake and mine. She let me sleep in our bed that night, but we didn't exchange any more words then. "Good night." I could feel the back of her ankles against my legs. At some point she even turned towards me in her sleep, but she didn't want to touch me. She needed just enough space, and I let her have it. A night without it in the house gave me the best sleep I had gotten since he died. I woke up feeling refreshed for once, but I quickly noticed the emptiness next to me. She must be gotten up early. As I left the bedroom, my brows furrowed as I heard humming from behind the nursery door. My puzzled expression twisted further as I saw my wife cradling it in her arms. "Good morning. I thought you had to get rid of him." "Good morning." "And I did. This is the new one," she smiled. "Wow. Already? So fast." "Express shipping." She shrugged with a chuckle. "Sweet. I'm gonna try and put him down for his nap. Could you brew me a cup?" "Yeah, sure." I smiled before closing the door behind me. The second she couldn't see me anymore, I stood absolutely baffled. Something about it just seemed off. How could she have gotten a new one that quickly? It didn't add up. She had gotten so attached to it. The thought of her wanting to keep it, no matter the mold, didn't surprise me. What hurt the most is that she'd lie to me. After filling the steaming mugs, I set them down at the table, and read the news on my phone as I waited for her to come down. He didn't put up a fight. Thank God. She sighed with relief as she trotted downstairs. That's good. I sipped my coffee, keeping my eyes on the screen. She sat across from me, taking slow sips as she stared off in a daze again. I occasionally glanced up at her, watching her tap her finger against the mug and bite her cheek. Are you all right? She laughed at the question, circling her finger around the rim of the mug. Weather's nice today, she responded. It is. Maybe you should spend some time outside. You could take him out for a walk. Yeah, that sounds nice. Her words trailed off like she was dreaming. I helped her take out the baby carriage that we never got to use and watched with unease as she laid the doll in it. Hope you do have a nice time, I smiled. We'll be back soon. We quickly kissed before she was out the door, and finally, I could breathe. It was only a mere few hours, but it was still time to breathe. It was also time to think. The past few nights, I had experienced things that were beyond what I thought grief would be like. I knew it'd be haunting, but not like this. I never really believed in the supernatural. I'd say I'm a skeptical person, but after the constant crying, the footprints, I couldn't make any logic out of it. I'd run in circles to death before it made any actual sense. And my wife seems to know more than she's letting on, but I was scared that one more question would push her out the door. I couldn't lose her, too. But now our grief wasn't just going down to different paths. It was going in completely opposite directions. She needed the doll to heal, and I needed it gone to heal, but I didn't know how to get rid of it without hurting her in the process. I thought about tossing it and making her believe she misplaced it, but that just felt cruel. I didn't need to put her under any more distress. By the time she got back, I hadn't really moved off of square one. I still understood nothing. I figured out nothing. I was just aching even more. Are you feeling better? Yeah, it was nice to get some sun. This little guy enjoyed it, too. Didn't you? Didn't you? She gushed. I couldn't help but feel so uncomfortable, watching her treat it like it was our son. But it's her way of coping and I had to respect that. To at least put myself at some ease, I told myself that I'm just under a lot of stress and that my grieving mind is just playing tricks on me. I guess being tormented by him was better than never seeing him again. That night, she laid close to me. Our legs intertwined as she fell asleep against me, her arm across my chest. I missed her warmth so much. I thought his death had cooled her touch, but she was still so warm, so comforting. It was easy falling asleep that night with her against me, like a child and their favorite stuffed animal. But I was stupid to forget that life isn't unfair, it's cruel. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by the cries over the baby monitor again. Only this time, as my eyes opened, I realized I couldn't move anything else. My heart pounded as I drew in panicked breaths. My jaw merely trembled as I attempted to speak. Pleas for help caught in my throat. A tear streamed down the side of my face as I waited for my wife to wake up, but she didn't. I was locked on that bed, unable to do nothing but listen to its cries. I wanted to scream, sob, punch a fucking wall, but I could do absolutely nothing. Suddenly, the speaker cut out, its cries halting with a static screech. My trembling breaths filled the silent room, as my body stayed frozen on the bed. I couldn't even squeeze out a groan to try and wake her. Then, the sound of a door creaking open came from the hallway, and the cries began again. Not over the speaker, but from the hallway. Its cries sounded distorted. They were deeper, more drawn out, and they sent goosebumps from head to toe. I scrunched my eyes as I begged to be able to move, the crying nearing closer. Then, the bedroom door slowly opened, the deep cries filling up the room. I looked over at my wife, who was somehow still asleep. I wondered if this was even happening outside of my own head. I couldn't see it, but I could tell it was moving closer, and with each step its cries grew deeper. It reached the point that it sounded like it was gargling on its own blood. When it stood by my ear, its sobs were deafening. Now, I couldn't move, and I couldn't hear anything besides this suffocating, dizzying crying that made me feel like I was drowning in molten tar. Da-da, it gurgled. And just like that, I felt my entire body unlock, and a scream worth 1,000 screams exited my mouth like a dam breaking open. The sound waves rippled my throat as I scatteredly threw myself off the bed and into the corner of the room. Jesus Christ! My wife shouted as she finally woke up, ripping off her sleeping mask and turning the lamp on. I let out wails of pure terror as I balled up in the corner, my body tremoring. My God, what happened? I could barely squeeze a word out in between sobs. Jesus! She hopped off the bed and kneeled next to me, my body flinching as she reached for me. What happened? I slowly turned to her, my eyes gaping wide. Instead of saying a word, I stumbled to my feet and made my way out of the bedroom. Where are you going? What happened, Jack? I ignored her calls as I threw the nursery door open. My eyes darted around as I searched for it, then realized it was in the crib. "Jack, what are you doing?" "I'm not doing this anymore." "Jack, can we talk about this?" She gasped in horror as I yanked it out of the crib. "You're right, Olivia, this isn't a doll. This is a fucking parasite, and I want it gone." "Jack, please, that's our son." "No, it's fucking not." She winced as I screamed. "Stop, please," she begged, tears pouring down her face as I began rapidly shaking it in front of her face. "This isn't our son." Then, in one final burst of rage, I gripped it by its throat and slammed it to the ground with all of my might. In this moment, I realized that I learned two things from the death of my son. Caskets aren't supposed to be that small, and reborn dolls aren't supposed to have internal organs. My wife crumbled to her knees as she let out those cries, the ones I could never forget. My breathing and heartbeat practically stopped, my body shutting down for a moment as I stared down at the spilled, graying organs and mushy skin that she attempted to cup in her trembling hands. I slowly looked up at her horror hanging on my expression. "Olivia, what is this? He didn't belong down there. He belongs with me. With us." I think my old bedtime story has a more sinister meaning. Every night, my dad was in charge of putting me to bed. He would help me brush my teeth, and then would tuck me into my nice, warm bed. Then he would tell me a story. Every night, it was the same story. The story of Bosco and Billy. I had lots of books in my room, as my mother would read to me throughout the day, but Dad would never read any of those books. He would always tell me the same story. I always assumed that either the story had come from a book, but my father had told it so many times that he didn't need to read from the book anymore, or that it was a story he was told as a child. I always enjoyed the story of Bosco and Billy. I always found that it would help me go to sleep. Usually, I would be almost asleep by the end of the story. I slowly learnt all of the words to the story, and would sometimes recite it along with my dad. For some reason, probably because I heard it every night for years, the story stuck with me, and even to this day, I still remember all of the words to the story. The story, in its entirety, is as follows. Billy the bear was an ordinary bear, with an ordinary life, but he had a small friend named Bosco, who got him into strife. Most of the time Bosco would behave, but sometimes he acted out. Billy tried to keep him in line, but sometimes he would break out. Like, one time Bosco was hungry, and decided he would steal food. Billy tried to stop him, and explained to Bosco that stealing is rude, but Bosco didn't listen. He stole the food anyway, and took it to his secret spot, and hid it away. Bosco took the food to the large oak tree that was in the woods. There he stuffed the food inside, and that's where he hid his goods. Billy never found the stolen food. It's still hidden there to this day. Bosco wishes that it is never found. He hopes, and he prays. Billy is kind and Bosco is a little bit silly, and that is the story of Bosco and Billy. Now, the story seems innocent enough, and I always thought it was a cute little story about two bears, but after recent events, I now know it is a lot more sinister than it first appears. My dad passed away a few years ago, and it took a toll on all of us. My mom especially. She began a little bit reclusive after my father passed, and so I didn't see her as often, because she shut herself off from others. I spent a long time trying to create a relationship with my mother again, and slowly, over the course of a couple of years, I did manage to reconnect with her. Things weren't as they once were, but she did invite me over once a week for a cup of coffee. During these our long visits, we would sit in the kitchen and talk about times gone by, about my childhood, about my time at school, and about all of the good times we had together. The one subject that didn't come up, however, was my father. I think the pain was still too raw for my mom to talk about him. On one of my weekly visits, though, I thought that I would try and mention my father, as I felt that it might do Mom some good to talk about him. I decided to mention the story that he would tell me every night. "Do you remember that story Dad used to tell me before bed? The story of Billy and Bosco?" I hesitantly asked, not knowing how Mom would react to the mention of her late husband. Mom looked up from her cup of coffee that she was drinking. She looked confused. Maybe because it was the first time he had been mentioned for a number of years, or maybe because she didn't know what I was talking about. "No, I don't remember that story," she replied. "You had a lot of books, so I can't remember all of them." I was a bit surprised by this. Dad told it to me every night, so I would have thought that she would remember it. I then went on to explain that it wasn't a book, it was a story that would recite, without reading it off of a page, because he knew it so well. "I thought that your father would read you a different book each night," she said, sounding confused. That's what he always told me anyway. I thought that this was especially strange because he never read me one of my books, and I would have thought that my own mother would have known this. What was this story about? She asked me. It was about two bears, one named Billy and one named Bosco. I was about to continue explain the story when my mom suddenly interrupted me. Did you just say the bear was named Bosco? She asked me, sounding quite serious. Yeah, that's right, his name was Bosco, I replied. That's strange, Mum said. She had a look on her face that looked like she was trying to remember something. Your father used to tell me about a friend that he used to have named Bosco, Mum continued. He used to say that Bosco would get him in a lot of trouble when he was younger. I never met this Bosco, which your dad said was a good thing. He also said that he only met up with Bosco only once or twice after we met, and then your father told me that he was no longer going to see Bosco. He said that he finally got rid of him. I was always curious as to who he was. I have never seen any photos of him, or any evidence that he existed, now that I think about it. So, it is strange that he told you a story that contained a character with the name Bosco. Mum stopped talking for a second and I didn't know how to respond. She then looked at me and asked, do you remember this story? Can you tell it to me? I recited the entire story to her. She listened to the whole tale without changing her expression. She took it all in and then she asked, an oak tree. Are you sure that Bosco hid the food in an old oak tree in the woods? Yeah, it was definitely an old oak tree. Was that? I asked her, sensing that something wasn't quite right. It's just that, on mine and your father's first date, he took me to an old oak tree that was inside the Shelton Woods. Only a 10-minute drive from here, she responded. He told me then that it was lucky for me that Bosco hadn't decided to interrupt their date. She then stopped talking and stared at the wall behind where I was sitting. I think it is time for you to go now. I'm sorry, she told me, a hint of sadness in her voice. I thought that maybe it was for the best that I did leave. I got up and gave her a small hug, which she didn't even seem to notice. Then I collected my things and headed out the front door. I got into my car and begun to drive home. On the way home, however, the thought of the old oak tree and Bosco began to fill my head. I couldn't escape these thoughts. I didn't know what it all meant, if it meant anything at all. I don't know what compelled me, but I had to visit the Shelton Woods and find this oak tree. I turned my car around and headed in the direction of the woods. 15 minutes later, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods. I took a step forward and entered them. I didn't know exactly where this oak tree was, but I was determined to find it. I explored the woods for around 10 minutes before I saw it. Standing in front of me was a huge oak tree, its branches extending high up into the sky. I walked over to the base of the tree. A sense of fear started to overcome me. Something didn't feel right. It felt like something terrible had happened here. I looked down at the ground, at the base of the tree, and I saw that the dirt there looked slightly different than the rest of the dirt in the woods. I don't know why I did this, but I bent down and began to dig in this dirt. The police say that if I hadn't started digging, then they probably never would have found them. There were 4 bodies in total, all young women around the age of 24. All of them had been dead for over 30 years. It was undeniable. They were all murdered and buried under this tree. The DNA testing was also clear. My father was responsible for the killings. Somehow, he managed to keep all of this hidden for many years. He never told anyone. The only clues that he gave were through my bedtime story, which I think was his way of confessing. The only thing I am not sure of now is, who is Bosco? Maybe my father and Bosco are the same person, or maybe he really did have a friend with that name. I don't think we will ever know. I don't think I want to know. Never sleep in your car on a road trip. I'm from Connecticut. I was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from Georgia, and would often make road trips down to visit her. I don't really mind. I love road trips. I've driven across the United States and back, all on my own. There's just something about traveling the highways of the US by yourself that's just so freeing. To save money, I would sleep in my car. It's not so bad. It's basically camping in a metal tent. Makes you feel like you're really, I just recline the seat back, keep the key in the ignition just in case, and doze off. No, I don't put anything up to block the windows for privacy. Maybe I should have. The trip down south is a comfortable 2-day drive. My stop would usually be somewhere along the Virginia-North Carolina border. So, for my previous trip, that's exactly where I stopped that night. Rest stops were often less trafficked and thus quieter than truck stops. Normally I would have stopped at a Love's, but I was so tired that I settled for the first rest stop I saw. It was oddly vacant that night. with only a couple lone cars sitting forlorn under the amber street lamps. Most likely travelers with the same idea as myself. I pulled into a parking spot away from the others, into the shadow of a tree and far from the street lamps. I figured I would have more privacy there as opposed to being bathed in light. So, I did my usual thing, locked my doors, opened the window just a hair for ventilation, kept my key in, reclined the seat, and went to sleep. I was never interrupted on any of these car camping nights, so I never suspected anything on this one. Then a sharp tap woke me up. At first, I thought I had heard it in my dream. I opened my eyes, a bit confused. Since I was leaned back, I was facing the ceiling and couldn't see anything. I hear another tap, like a tiny object hitting a hard surface. Came in an irregular rhythm. Was it raining? Was water dripping onto my windshield? I'm under a tree. Maybe something fell from the branches. Maybe a squirrel or a bird was dropped something. What if a squirrel was climbing around my car? Or what if it wasn't an animal? The thought occurred to me that it might very well be a person poking around outside. What did they want? Were the doors locked? Yes. The keys were in the ignition. I can leave in an instant. Still, I lay there, completely still, pretending to be asleep, pretending I hadn't heard anything, hoping whoever it was, they would leave me alone. It was better to not find out. I was too afraid to find out. It was better to stay here in blissful ignorance. Still the tapping continued. I had to do something. There was no way I was just going to stay there. I had to look. My heart was pounding. In that moment, it was deafeningly loud. Whoever was out there could probably hear it. I decided I was going to look. I was going to raise my head up and see what was making the noise. So that's what I did. What met my eyes sent a jolt through entire body. Every muscle fiber locked up in pure shock at what I saw. The faint glow of the street lamps cast just enough light for me to make out what I was looking at. There in the windshield, staring directly at me, was a face. Someone, I presumed to be a woman, was lying on my hood, her face pressed right up against my windshield. Her face was completely still, locked in a permanent grin. I froze in overwhelming terror. The eyes I stared into appeared to have rolled back, showing only the whites. The nose was turned up, pressed painfully into the glass. The lips stretched wide, revealing horrid rotten teeth. Even in the darkness, I could tell her skin was sickly pale, contrasting her long, filthy black hair. Whoever this was, she was clearly not in her right mind. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move. Finally, I got a grip on myself and shot my hand to the ignition. It turned over, making, in that instant, the most beautiful sound I ever heard. For a split second, I was afraid I might be caught in a horror movie scenario, the one where the car won't crank as the killer approaches. I reversed as fast as I could, trying not to give this creeper time to try anything. In my panic, I remember activating the windshield wipers in a futile attempt to get her off. I thought, was I about to drive out of here with some wacko holding onto my hood? Thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that, because as soon as I stopped, the woman leapt off, landing on all fours. Seeing my opportunity, I shifted into drive and gunned it. Right as I saw her reaching for the driver's side door, with my foot on the gas, I sped out of the parking lot. Behind me, I heard her let out a piercing shriek like that of an animal. I looked in my rearview mirror, and for a split second I thought I saw her chasing me, running on all fours, her black hair swinging wildly around her. I couldn't get a good look. As I rounded a curve in the road leading out of the rest stop, and merged with the highway, there, I picked up speed, and drove through the night. I did not dare stop again until I saw the morning light. My friend works for the city CCTV archives, and has seen some disturbing things. I hadn't seen Mike in a few months. He'd been buried in work and our usual weekend nights out had about disappeared. Then he called me on a Thursday and invited me over for drinks. I jumped at the invite, but took note of how depressed he sounded on the phone. By the time I got there, Mike had already started drinking and was slurring his words. A dark cloud seemed to hover over him, which got worse as we drank. I finally asked what'd been going on with him. Mike turned darker. Afraid. He said it had to do with work. I never really knew what Mike did for a living. I did know he worked for the city in the tech department, and was involved with the CCTV surveillance network, but I never knew what his day-to-day operations were, which he began to describe in detail. Mike explained there were thousands of cameras, scattered throughout the downtown core, outlying neighborhoods and well into the suburbs of our 1 million plus city. His responsibility was to categorize and archive all the incoming footage. Most of the footage went into very general classifications, and were saved in hard drive farms, and identified with a lengthy combination of numbers and letters for categorical archiving. They were truly meant to be forgotten about. It was an expansive task, but Mike designed and built an AI screening program that detected common patterns in footage, then sectioned out anomalous behavior for review. The vast majority wasn't noteworthy, something like 99.99%. Then there was the 0.1%, the car accidents, assaults, swarmings, rapes, abductions, murders. Those went into a special archive for use in criminal investigations. And then there was the 0.001%. They were held in a classified archive and contained footage capturing events that for all accounts were unexplainable. This was called the Tartarus Archive. I looked up the word, Tartarus, after and discovered it was one of the darkest, deepest prisons from Greek mythology. It was said that if you dropped an anvil from heaven, it would take 7 days for it to reach the earth. It would take another 7 days for the anvil to reach Tartarus. It was the place he sent titans when there was nowhere else that could contain them. When Sisyphus was condemned to an eternity of futility and frustration with a large boulder and a mountain slope, that punishment was carried out in Tartarus. As it turned out, the name was quite fitting to the archive's growing contents. Some footage could be simplified to strange optical anomalies in the camera, and coincidences of light or crackheads on a bender through the subway systems. Other footage asterisk though, defied logic. The others are what captured Mike's mind that evening. He'd been breaking protocol and bringing hard drives home at night. In fact, he'd been splicing the footage together, capturing and compiling repeat aberrations and editing them into linear sequences. Mike wanted to show me some. It wasn't in a bragging or showing off kind of way. It felt more like the sharing of a heavy burden kind of way. I asked if showing me would get him in trouble, but he waved the idea away. I said yeah, obviously I want to see what's going on in my city. Mike led me into his workroom, where he had monitors and towers and piles of externals set up. We sat down and he skimmed through some drives nervously. Then he landed on one. Mike told me this anomaly was codenamed Lincoln Spectre. He pressed play. On the largest screen, black and white footage started up, showing Lincoln Avenue, one of our less attractive downtown streets. At 3 a.m. the camera angle showed the length of Lincoln Avenue as it led into the downtown core. The street appeared empty and quiet. From a side road, a woman emerged, walking towards the camera. As she approached the intersection, she turned over her shoulder and appeared to scream. The woman took off, sprinting past the camera, which cut to a new, wider angle from another camera across the street. We watched the woman running frantically, seemingly being chased. But she was the only one on the street. There was no one else anywhere around her. The woman kept screaming as she ran, and the cameras kept following, cutting between different CCTV angles. We watched as the woman was chased into the middle of an empty intersection. She fell, then cowered as if something massive was standing over her. The woman's neck stiffened and she began to levitate off the ground. Her body looked like a rag doll as something lifted her by the throat until she was floating a dozen feet above the road, in the middle of the intersection. Then the woman's head snapped to the left and her body fell back to the ground. The video ended and went black. I sat shocked. Mike saw my expression and said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." I asked if that was real, if what I saw was unaltered, was raw footage. Mike said all he'd done was put the clips together. None of the content had been touched. He told me he found out the incident ended up being described as a hit and run, and the case was left figuratively open for more evidence to amass, which it never would. The department kept the footage hidden, claiming it was a camera malfunction. No one outside of Mike and his boss had seen the video of how the poor woman actually died. I started to understand the air of somberness Mike was carrying around. Mike started the next video. This one was codenamed Black Crab, and was much longer than the previous one. It started in the subway systems, at the underground Walkley station, shortly after closing up for the night. Walkley was the last stop on the route, and the exterior was shouldered by a new housing development on one side and untouched forest and swampland on the other. The camera was pointed down along the subway platform on the east side, and showed its entire length with benches and garbage cans populating it. At the far end, the tunnel was filled with darkness. The lights on the platform shut off and the station went dark. The camera switched to night vision, and everything became visible again. My eyes trained on the platform, waiting for something to happen. Finally, there was movement. It was coming from the tunnel. It was difficult to identify what exactly it was at first, as its movements were strange, and the footage was grainy. But it got closer to the camera, and I got a better look. It resembled a human, a man, but he was walking on his hands and feet, upside down, with his back arched, and his stomach pointed to the ceiling. He had long, dark hair that dragged along the ground, and he wore tattered layers of old jackets and torn pants. He moved like a crab, jerkily yet quickly and easily as he made his way to the staircase. The footage cut to a new camera, in the dark hallway leading to the stairs out of the station. We watched the crab walker claw up 2 steps at a time, and then crawl over the turnstiles and towards the exit. The footage cut again, now showing the exterior of the station entrance. The crab walker squeezed and twisted, and maneuvered his body through the locked and closed entrance gate. It looked impossible to accomplish, but he did it. Once outside, the crab walker eyed his surroundings before skittering off towards the woods and disappearing. The footage cut to an hour later, and revealed the crab walker reappearing from the woods. He was dragging a small animal by the tail in his teeth. The animal looked like a cat. The crab walker squeezed back through the gate, crawled through the station, and disappeared into the subway tunnel. Again, Mike saw my expression, and told me there was more. He showed me the length of the video, which was over an hour long. Mike had compiled over 20 sequences of the crab walker creeping out of the subway station, and into the woods. Mike skimmed through the video towards the end, and we watched the crab walker come out of a sewer in a downtown alleyway. It crawled over to a pile of garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Then it jumped into them, and some kind of vicious frenzy ensued. There was someone else in the pile of garbage. Hands and feet thrashed about as they were struggling for their life. Then the movement stopped and the hands and feet went still. The crab walker's body moved jerkily about, but I couldn't see what was happening because of the darkness and all the garbage bags and boxes obscuring the camera's view. Mike leaned over to me and whispered that the crab walker was eating a homeless man. This caused a criminal investigation as the dead body was found mutilated and festering in the open alleyway. Mike followed up on the inquiry. What he discovered was the crab walker was, who authorities believed to be a man named David Fletcher. Decades ago, David had been a prominent lawyer with a family. One Christmas, there was a house fire and his wife and kids were killed in the blaze. It was David's fault. He lost everything, including his mind. Everyone has a breaking point, whether they know it or not. A place where they bend too far, and then snap. David found his family and friends described his descent as nightmarish. David lived on the streets, became addicted to drugs and tumbled into mental illness. The last anyone knew of him was from 10 years prior. He'd thrown himself in front of a subway at the Walkley station, and no one heard from or saw him again. It appeared that, somehow, David had survived the subway hit. His back had broken and healed strangely, causing him to move the way he did. He'd adapted to the new posture, and lived in the darkness of the subway tunnels, finding sustenance from drain water, and the wild animals he caught. That was what Mike found out, at least. But then he said that was just the answer the investigators gave in Discovery. Who knows where the truth lay? Mike said there was always an answer for the videos he saw. Whether the answers were true or not, no one knew. But the ones that had to become public all needed explanations, however absurd. Either way, David was never found, and didn't reappear on the subway footage. Mike plugged a new hard drive in. He poured a fresh drink and told me this was the one that was troubling him. The file was code-named Cloud Mirror. I wasn't sure I wanted to see it, but before I could object, Mike pressed play. All the monitors lit up with footage from different intersections downtown, on the exact date and time as each other. There were 5 in total. The streets on each screen were empty and quiet. No cars or people. Suddenly, at the exact same time, in the center of the intersections, a small glow pulsed into existence. It was some kind of orb, roughly the size of a bowling ball. The street lights around it pulsed with energy waves as the orb grew larger. It grew to the size of a beach ball. Then it flashed out. The street lights went back to normal and the intersection was as lifeless as it was before. I asked Mike what they were. He told me he had gigs of footage of the orbs and had watched them repeatedly. He didn't know what they were at first. Then they started to change. Mike clicked onto the next video. Again, the 5 monitors lit up with the same intersections and time of night. But several weeks later, the street lights glowed and pulsed and an orb manifested into existence again. It grew to its beach ball size, but then altered its surface and glow. Something gas-like replaced it, growing outward into a couch-sized cloud of dark gray. One of the cameras was closer, so I got to see the small clouds in detail. It looked like a volcanic eruption wrapping around itself. They were large, constantly morphing blobs that curled outward from a glowing center, resembling a mandelbulb fractal as a gaseous-based organism. It was fascinating to see them floating in the middle of the street, so alien to our roads and stop lights and street lamps. Then they began to move, gliding down empty roads. The cameras cut to different angles, following the clouds on some unknown path, zigging and zagging onto new streets and through alleyways. Then they'd stop. The clouds hovered in the center of their intersection. They'd lower to ground level, standing straight up like a large coffin, holding rigid to the shape. Their exteriors continued to shift and mold together like magnets made of smoke. Something on one of the monitors caught my eye. Down the street, people appeared. They'd seen the cloud and were walking towards it. The group looked drunk and fascinated by the floating entity. So much so, they were approaching it. As they did, the cloud became brighter. The street lamps around it pulsed. The group were in some kind of trance, staring into the morphing blob. One of the group, a guy, stared into it like a zombie, then walked right into the cloud and disappeared. None of the group tried to stop him. Instead, another one followed him in, and another, and another. All 5 members of the group disappeared in the cloud. Then they reappeared, one at a time. The guy first, then in the order they went in. Only they weren't stumbling and boisterous and drunk now. They were walking upright, using minimal movements. They formed in a perfect 5-person circle for several seconds over quick words, then turned, and all went in separate directions. Their strides, arm swings and speed all matched. Another monitor showed a similar situation with a larger group of people, lost in reverie as they marched, one after another, into the cloud. Each monitor showed the same thing now, people entering the clouds and coming back out. Different. Mike stopped the video. I asked him if he'd shown this to anyone else. He said he hadn't, not even to his one boss, which was a problem, because he had a meeting with his boss in the morning to discuss the missing footage. I asked why he didn't show the footage to his boss. This footage seemed more than serious. People were being replaced by something. Mike sighed and put a new video on. The main monitor lit up and showed a new downtown street. The date was from earlier this week. One of the clouds was floating in the intersection. A middle-aged couple were walking nearby, the husband with a slight limp in his right leg. The couple saw the cloud and were sucked in by its aura. They approached it, eyes wide and mouths open. Both the husband and wife entered the cloud and disappeared. After a moment, they reappeared. The husband's limp was gone. Mike turned to me and said, "That was my boss and his wife."